In this video, we will be unpacking and assembling your 11-foot or longer conveyor. During the video we will discuss the unpacking and assembly process, combining the two conveyors together, attaching the conveyor belt, and how to properly adjust and link your guide rails. It is important to note that in this video, we will be using footage from the unpacking and assembly of individual conveyors 10 feet and less. This footage is useful to show you how to unpack and attach the legs to the conveyors. While this footage shows the unpacking and assembly of one conveyor, you will be unpacking and attaching the legs to two conveyors that will later be merged into one longer conveyor. The merging process, or attaching the two conveyors together, is covered in the second half of this video. The unpacking and assembly process. Shown here are the tools needed for the unpacking and assembly process. You will also be provided a T25 Torx bit that is located within the packing slip. It is important to note that in this video while unpacking, we are using a single 8-foot conveyor with the belt and guide rails attached as our example. The first step in the unpacking process is removing the lid and sides from the crate, leaving the conveyor on top of the pallet. Using the T25 Torx bit, remove the screws from the lid. You can now lift the lid off of the crate and set it aside. Next, remove the screws from each side of the crate. Once the screws are gone, remove the sides of the crate, leaving the bottom of the pallet with the conveyor exposed. The sides of the crate can now be moved out of the assembly area. Now that the lid and sides of the crate are gone, you can take inventory of the hardware. There will be a box next to the conveyor that has the hardware provided for the assembly. For the assembly of the conveyor, you will have 8 leg mounting screws, 8 leg mounting lock washers, and 4 adjustable feet. For bringing the two conveyors together, you will have an additional 12 machine screws, 12 lock washers, and 2 belt pins. We will now move on to removing the conveyor from the pallet, beginning with any end plates located on the ends of the conveyor. First, locate the 4 screws that fasten the end plate to the conveyor, 2 on each side. Once located, remove all 4 screws using a 1/8 hex key. Once the end plates are removed, the next step is releasing the conveyor from the pallet. There are 2 screws anchoring the end of the conveyor to the pallet. Unscrew both screws from the wood, using the T25 Torx bit. Repeat these steps to free the other side of the conveyor. Do not reattach the end plates at this time. We will now be removing the legs from the crate and attaching the feet. Have a team member lift one side of the conveyor, while another team member removes the leg laying on the pallet. Repeat this step for the other side. Now we will attach the feet to the bottom of the conveyor legs. The height of the conveyor is adjustable from 35 to 40 inches. The further you thread the foot into the leg, the lower the overall height will be. Before attaching the feet, set the height adjustment nut on each foot to about the same position along the thread. By doing this, the conveyor will be approximately level to start off, and only small adjustments will need to be made later when leveling the conveyor. In our example, we are setting the height adjustment nut approximately 1/2 inch from the bottom of each thread. Once the height adjustment nut is set, thread the feet into the bottom of the conveyor legs. Make sure to thread the feet all the way down until the height adjustment nut is snug against the bottom of the leg. It is important to note that for this next section, we will show an 8-foot conveyor with the end plates attached for demonstration purposes. Keep in mind that your end plates are currently removed, and will be reattached later on in this video. The next step in the assembly process is attaching the legs to the conveyor body. First, you want to determine which holes on the conveyor you will attach the legs to. There are 2 positions, more toward the middle, or more towards the end of the conveyor. If you will be attaching an accumulation table at either end, you should choose the mounting holes toward the middle, so you will have more room on both ends of the conveyor. If you will be mounting accessories in the middle of the conveyor, choose the outer mounting holes. Once you have chosen the holes for your setup, have 2 team members lift the legs upright, setting them with the feet resting on the floor. The 2 team members will now lift the conveyor and hold it over the legs. A third team member will guide the conveyor down to the chosen holes. For our example, we chose the inside holes as shown here. You can now attach the legs with the mounting washers and mounting screws using a 9/16 wrench or socket. Combining 2 conveyors. Next, we will combine the separate conveyors. To combine the conveyors, you will need the tools shown here. The first step is to bring both conveyors together. Put the two conveyors together approximately 6 inches apart. This is where the conveyors will connect to one another. When the two conveyors are delivered, the belt is attached to the section that includes the motor. The next step in the assembly process is to move the belt through both conveyors and link it back together. Begin feeding the belt through the bottom of the beltless section of the conveyor. Continue to feed the belt through the bottom of the beltless conveyor, and then wrapping around the end. Move the belt up and over the end and pull it back towards where the two conveyors meet. As you do this, you will be bringing the two ends of the conveyor closer to one another. Continue to slide the conveyors towards each other until the connecting plates and holes are aligned. When the connecting plates and 12 holes, 6 on each side, are aligned, use a 9/16 wrench or socket to fasten the conveyors together with the 12 machine screws and lock washers. Linking the belt. Once the conveyors have been connected, you will attach the belt together. To better understand how the links of the conveyor belt are connected, we've completely removed 2 of them. Each pair of links is held together by a metal belt pin pushed through 5 tabs, 3 on one link and 2 on the other. The outer tabs are slightly different. This one has a larger opening to allow entry for the belt pin, while this one is smaller and holds the pin in place. The belt pin is knurled on one end and smooth on the other. When connecting 2 belt links, it is important to push the smooth end of the belt pin into the outer tab with the larger hole, like so. When preparing to assemble the belt, begin by loosely placing the pin in the outer tab with the larger opening. It will not fit in the other smaller hole. Make sure you are driving the smooth end of the pin into the tab. Driving the knurled end could damage the belt. Link the tabs together, and push the pin through the first few tabs by hand. This should loosely hold the ends of the belt together while you align the punch against the knurled end of the pin. Push down on the belt with your hand to hold the punch in place while you carefully and firmly hammer the pin back in. Once the belt has been properly installed, reattach the end plates onto the conveyor. Do not completely tighten the screws, as we will now adjust the height of the end plates. In our example, we will show how to adjust the end plate of one 8-foot conveyor still connected to the pallet. However, the principles are the same for when you are adjusting and leveling the end plates on the conveyors you just connected. When reattaching the end plates, place a small spacer about 1/32 to 1/16 of an inch thick under the end plate in order to ensure that it will not rub against the belt of the conveyor when moving. If you do not have a spacer, you may just use your eyes to ensure the end plate is not rubbing against the top of the belt. Once the end plates have been leveled, you can use a 1/8 hex key to tighten the end plates in place. We will now ensure that the conveyors are sitting level. In our example, we will show the leveling of one 8-foot conveyor. However, the principles are the same for when you are leveling the conveyors you just connected. Place a leveling device on the top of the conveyor to see which way it needs to be adjusted. For our setup, we need to lower the right side of the conveyor. First, use a 15/16 wrench to loosen the height adjustment jam nut on the thread of the conveyor foot. Next, using a 7/8 wrench, turn the foot jam nut, which is solidly connected to the foot at the bottom of the thread, counterclockwise to lower, or clockwise to raise the conveyor. Make sure to alternate between the left and right foot in order to adjust the height of the conveyor and ensure it is level. Once level, use a 15/16 wrench to tighten the height adjustment nut on the top of each foot until it is tight against the bottom of the leg. Adjusting the guide rails. Before adjusting the guide rails, you will need the tool shown here. Each conveyor that you receive will come with the guide rails and brackets installed. The next step is to attach each side of the guide rails to the other. You will need the 2-piece guide rail clamps, as shown here. The 2-piece guide rail clamps come pre-fastened to either pair of guide rails. To begin, loosen, but do not remove the 2 nuts on each guide rail clamp with a 13mm wrench or socket as shown here. This allows the clamp to freely slide along the guide rail. Align the guide rails that are being merged end to end. Then, slide the guide rail clamp down to connect the 2 guide rails together. Once the clamps are in place, tighten the 2 nuts on each guide rail clamp with a 1/2-inch wrench or socket to lock the guide rails together. Next, you will adjust the width and height of the guide rails to work with the object that will be moving down the conveyor. In our example, we will be adjusting the guide rails on an 8-foot conveyor. However, the principles are the same when adjusting the guide rails on the conveyors you just connected. To adjust the width of the guide rails, begin by loosening the lock knob on the top of one of the brackets. Once the lock knob is loose, pull the guide rail away from the center of the conveyor. Repeat this step for the 5 other brackets. Once the width of the guide rails is in position, place 3 of your objects on the conveyor, one centered between each of the pair of brackets. Once the objects are in place, move the guide rails towards the objects. You want a gap 1/8 of an inch total, 1/16 of an inch on both sides, between the guide rails and your objects. This allows for any discrepancies and variances in object size to move freely down the belt. Once the width of the guide rails have been adjusted, tighten all lock knobs on the top of the brackets to ensure stability. To adjust the height of the guide rails, start on one side of the conveyor and loosen both of the lower lock knobs on that bracket. Adjust the height of the guide rail so that it is center with the bottle. Once the guide rail is centered, tighten the lock knobs for that bracket. Move to the middle bracket and loosen both the lower lock knobs, letting the guide rail fall. Keep the knobs of the middle bracket loose, and move on to the end. Loosen both lock knobs on the end bracket and adjust the height of the guide rail so that it sits in the middle of the bottle. Once done, tighten both of the bottom lock knobs on the end bracket. Move back to the middle bracket and position the guide rail so that the height sits directly in the middle of the bottle. Make sure to tighten the bottom 2 lock knobs of the middle bracket. You may now move to the other side of the conveyor and adjust the height of the other guide rail. Once the guide rails have been adjusted, your conveyor is now ready to be added to your production line.